Hey, thanks for stopping by again. Wanted to share with you a little story today about my great 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 grandfather. And if you were able to keep up with all of those greats, that is my ninth great grandfather. And his name is Richard Warren. And you may have heard that name in the past because Richard Warren was actually on the Mayflower, and he was one of the signatories on the Mayflower Compact. And if you're ever able to see a copy of the Mayflower Compact, which I'm sure you could find online, his would be the 12th signature. And if you go back on some of my prior posts, you'll be able to read. We have another descendant who was on the Mayflower, and I talked a little bit about the Mayflower Compact there. So I'm not going to repeat that one. But I wanted to talk to you today about Richard Warren. Richard Warren was born in England somewhere in around 1580. In the spring of 1610, he married a young lady by the name of Elizabeth Walker, who was my ninth great grandmother. And they had, I think, four daughters. And when it came time for the Mayflower to set sail, which they did in 1620. And I just saw they had five daughters, Richard and Elizabeth. He signed on to take the Mayflower voyage, even though he was not a pilgrim or a Puritan. He was just a merchant. And from everything that I can find, apparently he was quite well to do. He was part of something called the Leiden contingent, but was not a pilgrim. But he, for whatever reason, we're not really sure of why, he wanted to go to the New World. However, he felt that it would be unsafe to take his wife and daughters with him, and so he went by himself. And they left in the September of 1620. This is a very small ship, the Mayflower was, 100 feet long, 102 passengers, and a crew of between 30 and 40 people. It was very cramped conditions. And about one thing I found about the Mayflower is about on the second month out, the ship got into some really strong gales, and the ship's timbers were shaken so badly that a lot of the caulking fell out. And so the seawater was coming in. And even laying in their berth in the bowels of the ship, the people were wet and cold and very ill. You combine that with not very good rations, proper rations of food to eat, as well as some pretty unsanitary conditions, as you can imagine. It would prove to be a fatal voyage for some of the people on board. But even after arriving at their destination, within the space of several months, almost half of the passengers died in the first New England weather. And you can see I have low storage on my device there. So, so that's what I want to say. They were at sea for about 3 months. And when they first saw land, they came to what's now known as, of course, Cape Cod Hook, or now called Provincetown Harbor. They spent several days trying to get down to Virginia, which was their original destination. Finally had to give up, and they returned back to the Cape Cod Hook area. And on that very day that they returned, that's when they signed the Mayflower Compact, which Richard Warren's name appears on. Now, once they arrived in Cape Cod, Grandpa Warren was involved with some of the initial search parties that went out to look for suitable places. On board in that, in addition to Richard Warren, was Governor Carver, Bradford, Standish, Winslow, along with John and Edward Tilley, John Howland, Stephen Hopkins, who is another one of our relatives that I spoke before below. He was also part of the Mayflower Compact. Stephen Hopkins was part of that group, and Edward Doughty. They went out and tried to find, without even wearing suitable clothing, in that first New England winter, their explorations would result in the first encounter with Indians. And it didn't go so well because they learned that their slow-firing muskets were no match for rapid-fire arrows. And this was later became known as the first encounter. And so 2 of our ancestors took part in that adventure. It wasn't until about 3 years later, in 1623, that Grandpa Warren decided that things were now settled enough that he could bring Grandma Elizabeth over with their family. And they arrived later that year in 1623 on a ship called the Anne, A-N-N-E. And at that point, Grandpa Warren received 2 acres of land in one area and another 5 acres of land in another. 2 additional children were born after they arrived. One son, Nathaniel, and another son, Joseph. And they were involved with a lot of the initial founding and settling, putting together a lot of the New World colonies that would later, of course, turn, as we know, into the Americas. There's not a lot that we know about what happened with the Warrens after they arrived here. One thing I did find that Governor Bradford, there was something called the increasings and decreasings, which was a record of the activities. And there is an annotation that said Bradford assigns Richard Warren the title of Mr., which indicates someone of status, but it does not mention him at all in any of the recordings of Plymouth history. There's a few different points talking about land and a little bit of cattle that his wife received after he passed. But there's really not much mention of him once he arrived, other than he must have been fairly well off, but we don't have a lot of record about him. He did die. There's a question about the year that he died. Some believe it was in 1628. However, they did say that he is now buried in Burial Hill in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Grandma Elizabeth lived well into her 90s, and her death was noted in the Plymouth Colony records. And it says, Mistress Elizabeth Warren, an aged widow. This is October 2nd of 1673. This is the account. Mistress Elizabeth Warren, an aged widow, having lived a godly life, came to her grave as a shoke of corn fully ripe. She is also buried in Burial Hill in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Now, the interesting thing is that because Richard and Elizabeth's children all survived their youth, and they all married and had families, there are a lot of descendants of those original Mayflower passengers today, including descendants of Richard and Elizabeth Warren. For example, some of the descendants from them include Ulysses S. Grant, who was the 18th President of the United States and a Civil War general, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 32nd President of the United States, Sarah Palin, former vice presidential candidate and governor of Alaska, Taylor Swift, who I'm sure if you're under the age of 30, you probably know that name. She is an American singer and songwriter. Orson Welles, a noted American actor. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, an American poet and educator, also a descendant. Henry David Thoreau, also an American philosopher and poet and author. And Alan Shepard, an American astronaut. And last but not least, all of us, any of us in that Lewis line, we are also descendants of Richard and Elizabeth Warren, my 9th great-grandparents, and grateful for their efforts, and just thought that was kind of an interesting thing. So thanks for stopping by. We'll talk to you next time.